Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this Heritage Foundation Facebook Live. Well, it's so hard to believe that the end of the year is already upon us, but the Supreme Court's final sitting of 2017 just began this week. So today we're in the office of Elizabeth Slattery, who is our legal fellow in our Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, and she's going to tell us a little bit about what SCOTUS is up to. So if you could just explain kind of what's going on in the Supreme Court right now in these next 2 weeks, and why should conservatives care?
Sure. So there are a number of really important cases that are being argued this week and next week over at the Supreme Court, which is just down the street. I think the case that everyone has been waiting for, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, this is the case of Jack Phillips, the baker from Colorado, his First Amendment case against the state of Colorado, which is trying to force him to make cakes for same-sex weddings. So I think that's the one that everyone is really excited about. It's going to be next week, I think on Tuesday. And there have been some other important cases, though, involving the Fourth Amendment, property rights, and many other issues that are coming up.
So in a recent piece that you just wrote that was on heritage.org, you kind of outlined 4 different areas that we should really be paying attention to. At the beginning of this week, they started off with the property rights and patent holders case. Tell us a little bit about what that case is and why we should be paying attention to it.
Yeah, so this is the oil states case. It has to do, this may sound a little boring to listeners, but it has to do with the government's ability to revoke patents. So this is a process that Congress set up in 2011, which allows the government to, through an administrative process, look at the validity of patents. Now, this is instead of the last several hundred years, where federal courts would instead be able to adjudicate disputes over patents. And what happened here was you had oil states on the one hand, they had a patent, and they filed a patent infringement suit because there was another company that they said was infringing on their patent. Now, while this case was being litigated, that other company went to the federal government and said, federal government, I think you need to look at this patent because I don't think it's valid. I think you need to invalidate it. And so that is exactly what happened. The government canceled the patent, and now oil states is at the Supreme Court arguing that the administrative process violates the Constitution and that only a federal court can revoke a patent through this process, and that it violates the Seventh Amendment guarantee to a right to a jury trial. And so these are the things that they've been arguing up at the Supreme Court.
So the oral arguments were heard for that case on Tuesday. For those of us who might not understand Supreme Court proceedings and how things work, what does that mean? So they heard the case, and how long does it take now to figure it out?
Yeah, so with really complicated cases, it could take until the end of the term, which is the end of June, is when they'll issue the last of their opinions for the year. If it's a little bit easier for them, then they might issue an opinion as early as late January or maybe February. But this is one we're definitely going to be watching, and they have a number of other cases coming up. So the justices are certainly going to be busy over the Christmas holiday preparing for argument or for opinions out of all of these arguments.
Now, another case that's kind of scary to think about is the government seizure of cell phone records.
Yeah.
Tell us about that, and what does that mean for cell phone users like all of us?
Yeah, so this argument was yesterday at the Supreme Court, Carpenter versus United States, and this is the case of Timothy Carpenter, who was convicted of 6 robbery counts, I think 116 years in prison total for all of his crimes, and the government based a lot of its case on the police being able to go directly to the cell phone provider, I think it was T-Mobile, and get his location records from the government. And so the issue here is whether this violates the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable search and seizure and requires the government to get a warrant before it can search or seize some of your property. So the issue, of course, is that there's this federal law which allows the Stored Communications Act, which allows the government to go into court and get a court order, which is a little bit different from a warrant, under a lower standard of proof, and say, T-Mobile, I want these records. I want to be able to track where Timothy Carpenter has been. And so Carpenter is arguing that this violates his rights, and the government, on the other hand, is saying, we need this information, and we think it's consistent with the Constitution and this federal law. So it was an interesting argument at the court, and I think it could be sort of a left-right coalition that ends up ruling, but it's definitely going to be an interesting one to watch.
Now, looking forward to next week, you highlighted 2 big cases that are happening. One is on sports betting in New Jersey. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so a few years ago, the state of New Jersey decided that they wanted to legalize sports betting at their casinos. A lot of cash-strapped states are considering this as a boon for their economies, and so New Jersey passed a constitutional amendment because they had previously banned it via the state constitution. And the federal government came in and said, well, there's this federal law that says we can't force states to ban sports betting, but what we're going to do is force states to keep their laws that ban sports betting on the books. So this is the issue before the court. New Jersey wants to legalize it, and the people of New Jersey have voted to legalize it, but the federal government has come in and said, hold on, you gotta comply with this federal law, which New Jersey says is effectively commandeering the state into the service of federal priorities, which they say is unconstitutional.
Now, also next week is one that some are calling the biggest issue for social conservatives since Roe versus Wade. This is going to be the right not to bake a cake. The Masterpiece Cake Shop, Jack Phillips, who declined to design a cake for a gay couple. Tell us about that case.
Yeah, so, this has obviously been something that we've been waiting for to come to the court, and Jack Phillips is one of many others in the wedding industry who have had religious objections to being involved in same-sex weddings. And so his issue here is this violates his First Amendment free speech rights in addition to his free exercise of religion rights. But his free speech rights for the state to coerce him to speak a message that he doesn't believe in. And the state, on the other hand, says, we've got this public accommodation law, and it says that all businesses have to treat people equally regardless of your views here. And so this is one where I think everyone is going to be looking at Justice Anthony Kennedy. All eyes will be on him. I think he's historically the swing vote, but particularly in this area because on the one hand, he authored the gay marriage decision Obergefell. He's been a primary mover in the legal protection for the gay rights movement, but on the other hand, he cares deeply about the First Amendment and about free speech. So I think this is going to be a harder one for him than maybe some other cases, but we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on him during the oral argument next week.
Now, in a focus with the First Amendment, you also wrote an article recently about how libertarian groups who are, often they don't really tend to lean on social issues, but they're actually going to be backing this for the First Amendment rights.
Yeah, so our friends at the Cato Institute, along with a few other organizations, filed an amicus brief in support of Jack Phillips, and they make no bones about it. They say, we support gay marriage, but we do not support state coercion of speech, and that is what it comes down to in this case. So it was a great amicus brief. I'd recommend our listeners check out the article on the Daily Signal, which links to their amicus brief.
Now, and focusing on the justices, Neil Gorsuch, he's just started. A lot of people out there voted for Trump based on his court seatings and federal judges. What are your thoughts on his picks and Neil Gorsuch?
I think President Trump is knocking it out of the park. His picks have been fantastic. I mean, Neil Gorsuch, I can't say enough good things about him. He is exactly the type of judge we want on the Supreme Court. He's fair. He's impartial. He applies the Constitution according to its original public meaning. He's not up there to be a legislator. He's there to be a neutral and impartial arbiter. On the appeals courts and district courts, President Trump has made a number of wonderful nominations, and unfortunately, only 15 of them have been confirmed so far. So the Senate has a bit of work to do because he's made, I think, over 60 nominations at this point. So they've got some work to do to get some great people through. But we're excited about all of the nominees.
Now, we've touched on a number of things that are happening this week, but looking forward to 2016, what are some of the big cases that we need to focus on that are important to conservatives?
So the Supreme Court is going to hear some more big cases in the spring. Starting in January, they're going to hear a challenge to Ohio's attempt to clean up their voter rolls, which, voter fraud is a very hot topic these days with the election integrity commission that Vice President Pence is heading up. So that's going to be argued in January. And there's also a case involving pregnancy crisis centers in California and whether the state can force these pro-life centers to advertise the state's low-cost abortion program. They say this violates their free speech. The Supreme Court's going to hear that one. There's also a case involving unions and whether employees who are forced to subsidize a union, even though they're not public employees, even though they're not members of the union, whether their money can be put towards political expenditures. So these are some of the big issues that are coming up.
Well, Elizabeth definitely knows what she's talking about when it comes to the Supreme Court. And if you've enjoyed this today, you can actually hear her once a week on a new podcast called SCOTUS 101 on Heritage. If you tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah, so my colleague Tiffany Bates and I host this. It's once a week when the Supreme Court is in session, and we interview law professors, we interview people who are arguing cases at the Supreme Court. We talk about, everything from the serious to the silly. So we've talked about the Ruth Bader Ginsburg workout. There's a book by her personal trainer trainer put out. So we talk about that. And, we talk about, rumors of rifts on the Supreme Court between Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kagan. And, but we also report on the real news, on opinions that are coming out and cases that they're going to hear. So check it out.
Well, thank you for bringing us up to speed on what's going on at the Supreme Court. And thank you all for joining us today. Be sure to head over to heritage.org to see more from Elizabeth, and check out SCOTUS 101. Stay tuned on our Facebook page so you'll never miss when we go live.